from Parrotwood Memorial Library. Thank you all for inviting us to Strawberry Plains Senior Center. And we wanted to share with you today that we have received a $10,000 grant from the National Endowment for Humanities and the American Library Association. This grant is allowing us to do programs called Learning Through Epidemics and Pandemics Throughout the United States History. And today we're focusing on polio. And Miss Ginger Spradlin here will be talking to you about polio and sharing with you what we have learned from polio survivors.
We survived.
Okay. The biggest thing I want to know is, do y'all know the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic?
Well, pandemic.
Worldwide.
Exactly. So
It's local.
Local.
exactly. So in other words, what we usually saw with the polio epidemics, particularly in the 1940s and 1950s, was a localized area of infection, like say Hickory, North Carolina. In 1944, just as the boys stormed the beaches of Normandy to try to free France and the rest of Europe from the Nazis, at the same time they were having a polio epidemic. And so that would have been local. There's another little town in this area that had an epidemic, and back to Hickory, North Carolina, they stood up a hospital in 54 hours, believe it or not, through the National Infantile Paralysis Foundation. And they treated a total of 454 people for polio in that center during 1944 and 45. And then Withville, Virginia, which is just up the road from Abingdon, I think it's the next like big exit that you come to off of Abingdon. They even had signs there that would say, "Do not come into town." You know, they wouldn't let people come in because they had.
Spread like COVID?
No, that was the strange thing. Okay, that's one of my next big points. I'm awfully glad you asked that. They really didn't understand how it spread. They had, let me read you something that they said about polio, and this was to the best advice of parents. And of course, you can imagine, since it struck down usually healthy, well-fed, fair-haired children that the day before had been playing out in the backyard, and then all of a sudden they couldn't move a muscle and they might die, because as much as 15% of the children who got polio, and by the way, it was not only children who got it, but it was most commonly children who got it. You know, since it killed 15%, left a lot paralyzed, others in some way debilitated, like having one leg smaller than another or one arm small and reduced and crippled. What they told parents says, don't let, and by the way, this was something that was a summertime thing too. It didn't tend to strike during fall and winter, especially when it was cold outside. It didn't strike. You might have an episode, an epidemic that would last through, say, October, but by November it was gone. So they told parents, do not let your children mix with new groups of people. They said, do not get chilled, especially in hot weather, because there was some people, now this proved to be totally wrong, but just like, you know, we've been told with COVID, you know, take hydroxychloroquine, or, you know, do ultraviolet light, or, you know, whatever. We've been told all kinds of crazy things to try to do. That ivermectin, which when I use that on our cattle at home, I try my best not to get it on my hands, because it causes diarrhea. Very bad case of diarrhea, okay? But, you know, we've been told everything about take this, take this. Well, they were told everything about what to do to keep their kids from getting it. So they thought that if they were out hot and sweaty, that no way should they say come in and take a cold shower, or do what all kids want to, go jump in the local swimming hole to cool off. They said that was very bad. They also worried about fatigue. And I know, you know, we don't think anything about kids getting fatigued, because after all, if they go in and take a nap, they're fine, you know. But they were afraid of that. In fact, this is kind of interesting. They produced a film, because Hollywood got into this too.
Yeah.
And it was called The Crippler. Well, they had the national volunteers that helped out with polio. So they showed this crippler as being like a shadowy type figure in the for lack of a better word, I call it a long commercial. But anyway, they had the national volunteer who went in to save the children from the crippler. Guess who that was? Nancy Davis. Does anybody know who Nancy Davis became? Yes, she became the first lady. She was Nancy Reagan, that we all know, when President Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. So she was the volunteer that saved the children from the crippler. Okay, so Hollywood really got into this. The other thing they said is do keep the children clean. Don't let them get nasty. Now, today, what do we, now that's another tall word, how would you keep kids from getting nasty? But, you know.
Lord, they kill them.
You know, well, you know what's really funny about all this, or maybe I should say ironic? Personal hygiene is what they found out was at the root cause of why polio had become so severe. What they found out is just almost like oxymoronic. They found out that because we didn't have polio epidemics until sometime in the 1880s. There were a few cases of polio, like you can find on one of the carvings in one of the Egyptian tombs, a statue of like a prince or some nobility type figure, and one of his legs is very small and reduced in comparison with the other one. So they theorized he probably had polio. So there's been polio all along, but not all these major outbreaks that we came to be identified with in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s. Now, what went on, they have found out, is that polio is an enteric virus. Now, that was a new word I learned. Enteric simply means you ingest it. It's a virus that gets to the central nervous system, to your brain and your spinal cord. And I know even if we talk to people that have polio, a lot of times they'll say, well, I had it in my left leg. Well, they actually had it all over because it started out in their brain. In fact, the way they usually diagnosed it was with a spinal tap. Okay? So they had it all over their bodies. It's just that it may have affected one part worse than another. In fact, we interviewed a man from Knoxville down at the Powell Library week before last. And Mr. Larry Smith told us, he said, you know, I'd always assumed that all my damage was on the left side of my body because he said, you know, my left leg was the one that was smaller and didn't grow as muscle mass as much, and it was the one that got tired quicker and all this. He said he began to have symptoms of kidney stone. So he goes to the doctor when he's like 60. And now he had this when he was 5. So it'd been 55 years since he'd had it. He said all of a sudden, the doctor started doing some tests and he said, Mr. Smith, have you had a barium enema? Have you had a colonoscopy lately or something? No. So they did a little bit more looking into it. His right kidney was completely crystallized. They said all of his life he had always more or less operated. He said the doctor told him that maybe in the early part of his life it might have functioned 15% or 10% or something, but he said he had always actually been relying over here on this left kidney because he basically did not have a right kidney. So, and he said, that's from polio. You know, so there was all kinds of things that they learned about this. And what went on is in the 1880s, in big cities in the United States, they tried to get better public sewage. Well, obviously that makes sense, you know, get indoor toilets, you know. I mean, it helped out a lot of things. It prevented cholera, it helped to prevent typhoid fever. I mean, there was all kinds of things that not having open sewer systems improved. But one thing it did not improve was almost every child back at that time would play in water. And I know this sounds awful, but it was just a fact. In East Tennessee, why did we get public health departments? The main reason in the 1950s and the late 1940s we got public health departments in Jefferson County, Tennessee and Granger County, Tennessee was to get people to quit building their outhouses over the creeks.
Right.
Okay, I know that sounds, you know, today you're like, huh? People did that. Okay, well then of course after the sewage went downstream and it spread out during the next big rainfall and the ground dried, you had human feces on the ground. Well, a lot of people back then went barefooted. I remember hearing horrible tales of my grandfather on my mother's side who would just have a fit when school got ready to start because he had to buy 6 kids shoes. Okay? You know, I mean, all summer long, what had my mother and her brothers and sisters done? Out running around barefoot. She said the both soles of their feet were as black as tar and they were as thick as shoe leather. You know, because they ran around like that all the time. So, we ended up with polio being a fairly non-virulent thing that really didn't cause much trouble. A child in the 1850s, 60s, 70s that encountered feces in the wastewater with their hands and stuck their finger in their mouth, they might have ended up with a fever one night. They might have ended up with a snotty cold, you know, they might have had a little diarrhea, but it was nothing major. Well, now we go in, public health departments first in the cities, and then secondly out here in the country, we clean up our act. And again, it does a great job for many other diseases. You know, it stops the spread of a whole lot of stuff. But it allowed polio to mutate. And so polio then, for the few children that did encounter it, ended up being very virulent. And there was even 3 different strains of polio. The most dangerous one was something called bulbar polio. And that was where most of the time people didn't survive. We interviewed a lady named Joan Dowry, and she said that had she not had an intern who lived in her community, she lived in Kentucky, in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. And she said her dad called the intern because he was just 2 houses down or something from where they lived in the little town. And she said Hopkinsville at the time had about 1,500 people, so, you know, not a real big place. But she got him to come up there. Well, she said, I basically was like in a state of delirium. She said, I really didn't know much that was going on. But she said, I remember we got to the hospital in Louisville. And she said, there was an outbreak, there was an epidemic. This was sometime in the late 1940s. Late, she said 1949. Anyway, she said there was an epidemic in the area of Kentucky, up there in the northern part of Kentucky. And she said that what she could remember the most was, she said when she got there, said the doctor looked at this intern who brought her in and said, well, you might as well take her back home in that same ambulance you got her in and let her die peacefully at home. She is not going to survive. She has bulbar polio. The intern said, no, we're going to stay right here under the eave of the hospital. And said, because he told them also an iron lung. Do y'all know what an iron lung is?
Yes.
Okay. They look like horrible types of things. In fact, one of the stories I've just recently heard of on the local news was a man who had done just all kinds of things. But one of his challenges as a kid after being stricken with polio was if he could go for 3 minutes without the iron lungs assistance, somebody would get him a dog. So the title of his biography, which Miss Donna doesn't know this yet, but we're ordering today or tomorrow or sometime in the near future, is that book, 3 Minutes for a Dog. Because that was what, you know, I think a doctor maybe had bribed him, you know, you see if you can, you know, hold out and not have to have the assistance of the iron lung, because what it does, yes ma'am.
Is that iron lung where you have to live in that?
Yes, yeah, it's like an
That'd be
enclosed
horrible.
yes, I think so too. But anyway, some of them, what they didn't do it with the intention that it would be a forever kind of thing. They hoped, and in most cases it did work out this way. In most cases, the patients would improve, because what it does is it literally it does the motions of your diaphragm. So it expands your lungs and lets them contract, expand and contract, expand and contract. Now, in some cases, it has ended up being like that. There was a fellow named Fred Snipe Jr., S-N-I-P-E, and he was the wealthy scion of a man from Chicago. I think he was an only child. I know he was an only son, and I think he was an only child. And he contracted polio, and I can tell you how wealthy he was. This was back in the late 1930s. He had just graduated from one of the prestigious Ivy League schools. His parents gave him a round of the world trip. Okay? He was in China when he contracted polio. He was about 200 miles from, they called it Peking back then, we call it Beijing today. The only iron lung in China was, guess where? Peking, Beijing. So they put him in it, and he never improved to any degree. He was able to maybe for as long as an hour have some kind of a backpack type thing attached onto his chest, and he could get out of the iron lung long enough to sit up for a little while with that on. And he lived for something like 17 years. There's a picture in one of our books. In fact, it may be this one. Let me see if it's this one. It shows him at a football game, and he was an ardent Notre Dame person. Remember, he was from Chicago area. And yes, right here it is. And it shows him, they had propped him up in that iron lung at a Notre Dame football game. So he lived as normal a life as you could live and be in an iron lung. In fact, he married this lady. They had 3 children. I didn't say I knew how that happened. I didn't ask.
That's your favorite kids?
But anyways, I just thought it was just a fantastic story. But their idea really was that it would be a short-term thing and the person would recover. And in many cases, they did. In many cases, they did. Another book I would recommend to y'all if you like to read, and we have some of these down at the library. We're going to use these with the kids. It's written for juvenile age, you know, like 10, 12, 14. But this is a book I couldn't put down until I finished it. It's called Small Steps, The Year I Got Polio. And it's by Peg, I'd call it Kehret, but I'm not good at pronouncing things. It's Kehret. And she was a children's book writer anyway. And she contracted polio when she was 14. And she tells the story of being in a rehabilitation facility, a crippled children's home. And she talks about that her roommate was a little boy and that they listened to the Lone Ranger. And when she leaves her radio because she improves quicker than he did. And she said one of the things she regretted is that she did not know. Did he get better enough to get out of the iron lung? But she talked about, you know, how that they so much enjoyed. There was like 3 days a week, I think, on the radio that the Lone Ranger came on the radio, and so, you know, they would look so forward to that in the afternoon or in the evenings to get to listen to the Lone Ranger, you know, and they, one of them was Tonto and one of them was Kemosabe.
Yes.
You know, so anyways, but that iron lung was done with the intention that hopefully the person would progress and get better.
That's
Yes,
sort of
ma'am.
like the COVID, putting them on a ventilator, and
Yeah.
a lot of people didn't make it off of it.
Yeah, I think it was very, very similar. If you wanted to draw parallels between the two, I think because they did not do the iron lung unless it was just an absolute necessity. Okay, and that was one of the other things that my Joan Dougherty talked to me about. The lady she lives today out in Nashville area, and she told me, she said, I knew I was in bad shape. She said they didn't have the iron lung, and she said my intern friend said, Joan, don't go to sleep. Don't go to sleep. And she said the only thing I could do is, and I remember these old tiles when I was just a little girl in hospitals. They were tiles in the ceiling, and they had one hole right in the center. Some of you remember those? Okay. Well, anyway, she was counting those, and she said I stayed awake for numbers of hours by counting those. And she said eventually I did go to sleep, but she said one thing she cautioned me about, she said never ever, if you're in a sick person's room, she said even if they're in a coma, she said don't talk about they're not going to make it, that
Oh,
there's no
gosh.
hope for them, that they're just gonna die anyway. She said the last thing you lose is the sense of hearing. And she said if I could count one time, she said I can count 20 times that different doctors and different nurses said, why are we wasting time with her? She's not gonna make it.
Oh, goodness.
Are they getting more cases of polio now?
No, let me explain that.
Well, the reason I asked you, parents today, some parents is not making their kids take a shot.
Yes, and that is very bad. Now let me explain what can happen. Today in the U.S., it is eradicated. There are no cases of polio in the United States that we know of, okay? That's new cases. Because they give the Salk vaccine, which is the
That sounds great.
dead virus. In other words, it can't communicate polio. Now, I bet you a lot of us had the sugar cubes. I had a sugar cube. Anybody else remember getting a sugar cube? Okay, those were live virus vaccines. They were Sabin vaccines. And today, the state of Tennessee, I think in the year 2000, voted not to use the Sabin vaccine at all because it could cause polio. In fact, we've contacted, I've been so fortunate, I want to give this lady a lot of praise. Her name is Nikki Lancaster, and she's from out at Hermitage, Tennessee. And a lot of the interviews that Miss Donna and I have done with the polio victims, polio survivors, is through her group. She's the head of the Polio Heroes Tennessee. And it's a part of the Tennessee Easter Seals Association. I know y'all are probably familiar with Easter Seals. We used to always get them at Easter and, you'd be asked to do a contribution. And it's part of March Dimes. Okay. Anyways, and I'll be honest with you, today our talk is not being exactly like I planned it, but it doesn't matter. I love the fact y'all are asking questions because we're covering everything. Miss Nikki Lancaster put us in touch with so many people we have interviewed. Like the Joan Dougherty that I mentioned earlier, Miss Nikki put us in contact with her, okay? Today there are cases of polio, active cases of what they call wild polio. In other words, like people used to contract out in the environment. In India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Afghanistan. Yeah, Afghanistan. So the danger is this. Remember what did we do at the end of the Iraq-Afghanistan fiasco mess? We took in a lot of refugees. Now, one of those little children gets wild form of polio, because once again, it's still in the environment. I don't care if we have had indoor toilets since 1948 or whatever here in Jefferson County. One of those little Afghan children comes down with it. They go to school with it. Now, who's in trouble?
All the kids that's in school.
All the kids that have not been vaccinated.
Yeah.
So, I understand sometimes parents' hesitation about vaccines. I can remember being this much. I just have one daughter, and she got real sick, or pretty sick, from having the measles, mumps, and rubella, that 3-in-1 shot.
Yeah.
She got pretty sick from it. She broke out some, and she had some swelling like she had mumps and so on. And so when she got to go into college, or was about to go to college, they wanted to have another MMR done. And I said, no, we're going to do a blood titer. You wouldn't believe the red tape I had to go through to get a blood titer done. You would have thought I was asking a doctor for some miracle cure. All I wanted to do was take her blood and prove that she did have immunity, because I knew that if she was going to get immunity, as sick as she got, she'd build it then, or she was never going to build it. So I finally got the blood titer, and yes, she's fine. She had all kinds of immunity. But, I understand parents being somewhat hesitant. But put it like this, the chances your child would get some kind of disease from a vaccine, or your grandchildren, is so infinitesimal in comparison with the chance that I don't mean to point at Afghanistan refugees. I mean, it could be somebody coming here from Ukraine I know they interviewed a black person from Nigeria who was going to school over there and had her children. She was going to school to be a doctor, I believe. Well, she was part of this refugee bunch that came that was in Ukraine, and then they fled from Ukraine. She may end up here.
Well, how could they spread it over here?
Like
Like
she
that.
just told you.
You just told you,
The children.
the children.
Yeah,
Well,
but how
like,
would the
okay.
children get it from another children?
They don't get it from another
No.
child. They would pick it up from the environment, from around here, like say you played in the dirt. Well, a virus it's one of those things. I remember when I used to teach biology in high school, I used to describe a virus as being not quite alive, because a virus has to have a host to live in. But it's like almost like an inert particle. It's just, all it really is just a core of either RNA or DNA, the nucleic acid, and it's got a protein coat that's very unique to each virus. Okay? I know y'all have all seen the coronavirus, or at least pictures of the blooming thing, right? You know, where it looks like some kind of ball with all kinds of spikes that are coming out of it, you know? Okay? Well, that spiky thing is where the protein is. Well, if you've got a child that's never been vaccinated, and they play in that, in the dirt that maybe, like say, if we go over to Richland Creek, I'm sure Richland Creek floodplain over there in Granger County is rife with polio. Because I can still remember when Mrs. So-and-so used to have her toilet hanging over that creek. I can remember that when I was growing up, going to school, I thought, why doesn't she have a toilet inside?
Even if it wasn't over the creek, you got your outside toilets, when it floods, where's it going?
Yeah.
And septic tanks. A lot of people in this area have septic tanks with drain fields.
Yeah,
Okay,
and
if
that could be.
floods, it's gonna do the same thing as an outhouse.
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. So, and then too, you might have a child that maybe they have just come here from Afghanistan, and maybe they already, see, that's another thing. Polio has about a 2-week incubation stage, okay? Whereas COVID has a 5, 7, 8 day incubation stage.
7 to 14.
Okay, 7 to 14 now. Okay. Anyway, polio goes a couple of weeks, and that's another thing. The reason most of them had no idea where they got it from. I only had one person we've interviewed. Miss Donna, how many interviews have we done? 17, 18?
Somewhere's around there.
Yeah, we've done several, so we've really been, and I want y'all, if you know somebody that's still living that had polio, please let us know, because the more interviews we can get, the better. In fact, I'll be honest with you, I think that's one of the major reasons we got the grant, was because we were going to collect these first-hand stories. And that's what's kind of important is I've learned how varied polio was just from doing these interviews, because you had everybody from one little boy who said, oh, my head was just pounding, and I was at church, and I got down in the floor and put my head up on the seat trying to hope it would ease off and I could go to sleep, you know, that kind of stuff, all the way to others that said it was just like searing pain that went down my legs. So there's, you know, the symptoms. And, you know, if you stop and think about it, is that a little bit like COVID? Yeah, you'll have somebody that has diarrhea, you know, and that's about all they've got about it. You've got some kids that'll have the sniffles. You've got others that, you know, just can't breathe from it. You know, it's just, it really just really takes over the respiratory system. Okay, now, back to this kind of polio. Who was the most famous patient that was struck by polio and he was 39 years old when it happened to him?
FDR.
Exactly. Okay, Franklin D. Roosevelt. In fact, I really think the reason that we got the vaccine, Jonas Salk was the one who came up with the killed virus vaccine, the injections, in 1955. Okay? FDR and his law partner, Basil O'Connor, were behind this idea of getting a vaccine. Jonas Salk had originally done research on the flu vaccine. Now, something else we're talking to some of the other groups about, we have a book club. If some of y'all would like to join us here in a couple of weeks, we're going to have a book club discussion about the Spanish flu of 1918. Well, Salk first started investigating that, trying to get a vaccine for the flu. And then he was able to get a grant, 1940 grants, and he got a grant to study polio. Okay, and that's how he did it. Now, FDR, what do we know about him? Did he recover much from polio, or was he left with permanent
No,
disability?
he had a permanent disability,
Yeah.
he was crippled.
Yes, he did. Now, I'll tell you what, if we'd have asked people in 1945 if he was permanently disabled, most people would have said,
No, they covered it up.
They covered it up very well
Yeah.
because they were afraid it would ruin his career politically. And I remember being at ETSU after I retired from teaching, and I went back on my master's in history just because I'd always liked history. And one of my professors said, and he wasn't going to tell this, but I did. And I just see him going, oh no, I know where she's going. I'm old enough to have remembered when people really revered FDR. I mean, they thought of FDR as second only to God. And I said to him, I said, well, my grandmother had a picture of the Lord knocking on the heart's door on one side of the post of her dining room, and the other was a photograph of FDR. He said, I knew that's what you were going to say. Well, if you stop and think about it, what did people at that time think? He guided them through the Depression,
Yes, he did.
came up with all kinds of programs. I'll be honest with you, the farm I live on today would not be there. My parents were sharecroppers on both sides. My daddy went into what was called the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCCs. Well, while he was there, he saved his money for that 18 months. I think this is hilarious. He was a teacher. I'll tell this real quick and get off of it. He was a teacher for his group of men. And he was supposed to teach them their GEDs to get their high school equivalency diploma. What was hilarious about that is guess how far in school my daddy had gone? Beginning of 7th grade. But what happened, they'd sent a teacher, it was up here at Jefferson City at that camp, and they'd sent a teacher from one of the schools, and it was a lady teacher. Well, those big old burly boys, you know, they were all from 18 to 24, I think, in that camp. And they were just too rough for her, so she goes and tells the camp commandant, I'm not coming back anymore, I can handle this, you know. Well, they saw, I guess my dad had gone to the public library, and they saw what he read, so they knew he could read well. So Dad said one day, said after we finished work, said they handed him much math problems, said here we go, do these. And he said, so I did them and handed them in, said they looked at him and said, you want me the teacher?
You're
And so Daddy said most of the time he got to shoot pool, but he got $3 extra a month for, you know, going in and being in a certain place at a certain time. Okay, so FDR did a lot of things for people. He guided them through the Great Depression, saw them through that. He ushered in Social Security, which I know I'm grateful for. I just got my first check last month. Okay, all right, so, you know, he was great, and then of course what followed right on the heels of the Great Depression? Yeah, World War II. And it was horrible all over, you know. And so many people just regarded him as being almost like the savior of the nation. Okay. Now, about his polio, they really don't know, like so many other cases, exactly where did he get it. They know that he had been in a Boy Scout camp in upstate New York, and that he had been there a couple days. Then he went to Campobello, which was their summer home, which actually is in Canada. I didn't realize that till I started studying for this book. But anyway, he went there to meet Eleanor and the 5 children and stay with them over the summer months where it was hot. And they said that when he got there, that he was so energetic that he wanted to do things with the family, and and again, this goes along with their idea back in the 30s and the 40s that you got it because you got overtired and then you got cooled off too quickly after you got hot. Now, we know that's not true today, but they said nevertheless that he'd run over the whole island of Campobello, and that he had swam between one point and all that. But he goes home that evening, tells them he doesn't feel like eating supper, goes up, goes to bed, and by the next morning he's got a fever, he's dragging his left leg. He said he composed himself enough to shave, and that was the last time he was ever able to walk on his own. Now, what do we know that he founded? What area in Georgia did he found for his polio? It was a place that he could go, and it had hot mineral springs. Warm Springs, Georgia. Y'all may not believe this, but we actually interviewed a 95 or 6 I
I'll
forgot.
have to watch the video again.
Okay, she's 95 or 96, a little lady who was here in Jefferson County, and she, as a 30-something-year-old mother, would go down to Warm Springs and they'd refit her for braces. She said, I never did do too many therapies down there, but she said I would go down and like today they would measure me for the braces. She said tomorrow we'd just kind of, stroll around, sit in the sunshine, sit by the pools, whatever. And she said then the next day, she said they'd have them made, and she said they'd fit me for them and let me walk around a bit in them. And she said if they didn't like how it worked, she said we'd stay another night and they'd, re-shave off this over here and, rework that and get it refitted so she could come back home. So I thought, how neat, we even got somebody that had been treated at Warm Springs, Georgia. But anyway, Roosevelt went there, and he felt like it was so good because if you've ever been in water, do you really have to, in fact, as we get older, that's one of the things that they recommend is any kind of pool exercise because you've got buoyancy under you. And if you've got a mineral springs, you've even got more buoyancy under you. So, and two, that's another way they can take pictures of FDR as being vibrant and active because they take pictures of him in the swimming pool. Yeah, so they did kind of keep it covered up. But he was really good, though, about raising funds for polio. First started out as birthday bashes. They started in 1934. He was born on January 29th, and they would always, his birthday's the 30th. The first one was done on January 29th because they picked the weekend that was closest to his birthday on the 30th of January, and they would do this birthday celebration. And a bunch of big cities, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, would do all these birthday bashes, and they would raise money. And they would have a theme that say, we dance so others might walk, okay? Now, of course, FDR doesn't live a long time because what happens to FDR in 1945 before the war ends? He dies. Now, I'll tell y'all one interesting story about that. It's got nothing to do with polio. Most people think he died from what? Cerebral hemorrhage. Most people think he died of a hemorrhage. Okay, he actually died from melanoma. Did anybody ever see the big dot up here above his eyebrow in the pictures? That was melanoma. Now, again, I'm not saying that he did not necessarily have a stroke, but it was a stroke induced from melanoma. So he definitely died. In fact, that's how Ginger, how'd you get into this history lesson? Anyway, Truman, when they asked him to run for vice president, he didn't want to do it because he was a powerful senator from Missouri and had a lot of influence in Congress. The White House people, like chief of staff and people like that, went to Truman and said, Mr. Truman, we're not asking you to run for vice president. You're going to be president in the United States. Said FDR will not live out the term.
That's what Obama done.
That's true.
Okay, all right. So, anyways, what happens after FDR dies on April 12, 1945? They can't have the birthday bashes anymore. What do they do? Now, this is something probably every one of us remember. As a little girl, I remember sometime in school each year we get this little card, and we were supposed to fill it full of our
Dimes.
Yes, we did the March of Dimes. And it was initially for polio, crippled children's homes, Warm Spring, Georgia, all the different treatment facilities. And then they worked it into birth defects, the March on birth defects. Okay, and I remember those dimes. Well, the way it originally got started was after FDR died, they needed to come up with something to where they could get volunteers to work toward polio. And so they got like a precinct captain. Every community would have, my mama did that. I remember her doing it. She was the one, and what you were nominated for is that Saturday night in January, which would have been commemorating FDR's birthday actually, although they didn't call it that anymore. They were responsible for going to people's houses that had their porch light on and get a donation. Okay? Now it might have been $1. I'm sure if you went to our house, we didn't have a lot of money, you'd have got $1. Okay? But back then, $1 went a whole lot further than $1 goes today. Okay? And so they did that, and they had just multitude success with that because every mother you know, any mother would be willing to do that. And they did it like, they'd put flyers up in the grocery stores. They'd send flyers home with kids. They'd have all kinds of radio advertisements. Now you have to remember, 1940s is radio time. We don't get too much into the television time unless you run a big, big city like Chicago or New York until the 1950s. That's when TV starts to come in. Okay, so we have the March of Dimes that replaces the birthday bashes for Roosevelt. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about treatment of polio. The Sister Kenny method. Anybody ever heard of her? Okay, Sister Kenny was an Australian nurse, and she came here with the idea that she could popularize her methods. And I remember that there's been a couple people we've talked to that said they had the Sister Kenny method, and they might not have known the name, but they knew the stink of a wool army blanket. Do any of y'all remember the green army blankets?
We had
We
some
have
now.
a couple, yeah.
Okay, those green army blankets is what she would cook up. She'd cut them in strips, and she'd put them in a pressure cooker, and she'd get them just super hot. Well, then she would wrap them in plastic and then wrap them in another cotton cloth of some sort, and she put that on children's muscles where it'd been affected by polio. And this was after the contagious phase, okay, after the fever broke and all that. And I know that Larry Smith, the man that we interviewed 2 weeks ago, he said he could still remember, he said that smell of that hot wool blanket, he said, I'll never forget as long as I live. He said it was just a certain odor. Yes, ma'am.
So if they were running fevers, you could catch it from them?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, because I believe that's what he was
Yeah,
asking
it was
about.
contagious, yes. If the person is running a fever, you can catch it from them. Now, that's another thing though. We only have talked to, out of our 17 or 18 interviews that we've done, we've only talked to one person that his sibling, his brother, had it at the same time he did. Most of them are very isolated. Most of them say there was, like when we talked to, say, Larry Smith, he said, nobody in our community had it. Don't have a clue where we got it. You know. But yes, there is a contagious phase that lasts anywhere 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And Miss Nikki Lancaster that I mentioned before, she said her sidewalk must have had polio. Because she said they put her, as she was recovering, in her dining room. And, fixed her a lower bed and all that kind of stuff. She said, I could see the children walking to school, and she said they'd walk on my side of the street till they got almost right to our house. She said then they'd cross the street, go up the way, and she said, I could still watch them. She said, if I turned my hand, she said, I could watch them go back to our side of the street. So she said, our street had polio, our sidewalk had polio. She said it was very obvious. But see, that just proves to you, when you don't understand how something is communicated, you're fearful of it. Does that make sense? Okay, but yeah, they can do it across the street. Okay, now I'm going to tell you just a little bit about how we ended up with the March of Dimes poster child. The first one was named Donald Anderson. He was in 1946. He had pictures made with all the famous ball players like Joe DiMaggio, who had 56 straight hits and all that kind of stuff. And they portrayed it that he was not going to be debilitated at all, but they did an interview with him and he said yes, he had lots of debilitations that he wasn't supposed to talk about, how that he was still damaged by polio. They wanted to make it look like that treatments were really working. And Sister Kenny, she then would stretch the muscles of the child after they'd done the hot pack treatments. And that does seem to have worked. Many people that we interviewed said, yes, it wasn't. And this book is real good. This lady, she got the Sister Kenny method, and she credits that a whole lot with her being able to walk. So sometimes Sister Kenny didn't get a good reception. She didn't get a good reception with the New York doctors nor the Washington, D.C. doctors at Walter Reed, but she went to Mayo right before she decided to leave the United States, and Mayo said, yeah, let's try anything. So it became kind of a treatment that was used worldwide. Dr. Salk, he worked in Pittsburgh, and he worked in a basement, and he had a lot of trouble getting funding and everything like that, but he finally did get enough funding, and he was able to just come right on in and join us.
Hey, how
He
you?
was doing good. He was able to come up with this vaccine. It had some drawbacks. One of the things was they got so overjoyed when they found out that they had a vaccine that seemed to be effective that they went into overload, because this is late winter 1955. And Dave Garraway, who was the head announcer of the NBC show, the Today Show that we still have left over, okay, that's still on the air, he announced it, that they had a cure. And they said that it was almost like having another VE or VJ day that ended World War II. That it was that kind of a, they said it was like a collective, you know, we finally have something that's going to combat this. Well, then they went so much into production of that vaccine that it was not well regulated. And there was something called the Cutter fiasco out in California. And it was because they were using the strongest form of polio, that bulbar polio, to design the vaccine from, and several children contracted it out there because they had gone too fast in trying to make it. So Salk's vaccine fell into disfavor, and we had it, and by the way, both these guys were Russian. I don't know if you know that or not, but Jonas Salk was Russian, and so was Sabin, so was Albert Sabin. And so then Sabin got more contracts to try to come up with the live virus, the mutated live virus, and he did later on, and so that's where all of us went to the schools and took the sugar cubes. Now, what I remember about the sugar cubes is I really don't even remember getting the sugar cube. I know I did, but I don't remember it. Because what I did, I remember going to the old Bean Station Elementary School, the only time I was there. And it was so exciting because these were called Sabin Sundays. They figured Sunday afternoons, most people didn't work back at that time. In fact, you was lucky if you could find a restaurant that served anything on Sunday. I mean, everything closed on Sunday. You didn't have Walmart open. You didn't, you know, I mean, in fact, I don't know that there was a Walmart, but the Kmart. The Kmart was closed. The downtown dime store.
That's when they come up with the blue law.
Yes, I remember the blue laws. I remember the blue laws.
Yeah.
I also remember when we had 5 Baptist ministers who were on our beer board in Granger County. Now, what was the chances that we were going to have the sale of beer in Granger County when we had 5 beer board members who were Baptist ministers? I swear that is the truth. Many years we had 5 on the board. Okay, in fact, I think there were only 5 members of the board. They were all Baptist ministers. Okay, but anyways, everything was closed down. And we had the blue laws, and so on Sunday they thought they could give vaccines easily.
What's a blue law?
Everything can open up on Sunday.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So in other words, the only thing, when I was a little girl, the only thing I can remember being open on Sunday was a couple of gas stations and the churches, and that was just about it. And I think the reason they had the gas stations open was mainly so you could go to church. Yeah, you know, honestly, I mean, I'm not saying if you wanted to go for an afternoon ride, you couldn't do that, but I really think that is why that the gas stations were, I mean, there was nothing open. You know,
They
you
was
just
in Waynesville, North Carolina, they was a Sky City, built in a big shopping center, like that's the beginning of the box store.
Yeah.
Was Sky City, and that's when they enacted the blue law, so they could be open.
I'll
So,
be darned.
anyways, the Sunday afternoons was when we were going to sugar cubes, and I remember going to the old Bean Station Elementary School, and the lines were so long, because, I mean, that's the other thing. I wish we'd had the same response to the vaccine that was delivered for the COVID as we had to the polio. Because if everybody had gotten vaccinated, we wouldn't still be having COVID. It would be something we'd go, oh, that was 2 years ago. You know, but everybody lined up. There was no consideration. In fact, the only thing was, I think they did it several different Sundays. Maybe they'd do one, I don't know, let's say May 2nd or whatever, and they'd do another one May the 18th. you'd hear neighbors on the phone talking on their 8-party line system, okay? And sometimes you'd even hear, I remember my mother one time was talking to Miss Pauline, the next door neighbor, and she was talking about when she was gonna go, and Miss Pauline was talking about when she was gonna go. Well, Miss Virginia got online and said, well, I thought this would be a better day. And so all four of them was on the phone at the same time. Okay, but anyways, everybody went, and the only thing I remember is just I got to go play on the swings because it was like an hour and a half wait or something till you got to the doors. And I remember my mother, she looked at me and she said, you look like a wild Indian. I'm so ashamed. I'm going to take you into these doctors and nurses in here, and you're sweaty and grimy, and you can't tell what end your hair even grows in. You know, so I remember she was just mad at me that I looked like a wild Indian, you know, because I'd enjoyed myself. But anyway, the Sabin vaccines could possibly give polio. Miss Nikki Lancaster told us that one of her people that's in her polio survivors group is only in his 40s, and it is from a case of where the Sabin vaccine backfired. Because when my daughter was little, you got 2 of the Salk vaccines, it was the kill virus, followed up by 2 of the Sabin vaccines. Now that's completely gone. You get nothing but, I think it's 3 of the Salk killed viruses. They've done away with Sabin. So, you know, their thinking is completely backwards. Okay.
That's the ones they put the drops in their mouth, correct?
That was the Sabin. The Sabin could either be drops or sugar cubes, either one. Yeah, it was an oral vaccine. And then the shots were the, in fact, we came across somebody, and that's what I want to end this discussion with, is I want y'all to think, if you know anyone who's a polio survivor, if you know anyone who was active in giving the vaccinations. We've run across a lady up at White Pine who was one of the health officials that came out to give the vaccine. So we're anxious to do her interview. We'll have to change up her interview a little bit, but we want to try to get her. I tried to call her a week before last before I left for vacation and didn't get a hold of her, but I'll try again and see if we can get in touch with her. So, all right, any questions from anybody?
I thought that white spot was a polio, you know. where
That's
you-
smallpox.
A smallpox.
That's smallpox.
And we are, we want to invite you all. We're doing some live programs at the library. We're going to do the introduction of the different subjects we're doing, and then we'll take each subject and have, so that's in May, this May, sorry, it is May, and we will be having that. We'd love to have y'all come to that.
Yeah, we'd love for y'all to come down. We're going to do
Do
one
you
on
think it'll
smallpox.
come back?
I'm scared because you're getting so many people that are not
That's
vaccinating.
what I was thinking.
I'm very fearful. You know, and it's just like anything else. The larger number of people you have that are not protected from something, and then just one little spark, it's kind of like it doesn't take much to start a house fire. You know.
They claim, go ahead.
Go
Donna.
ahead.
You go ahead.
They claim it's your religion that you don't take the shots. That's what I see on TV.
Yeah, sometimes that's what people will say.
Sometimes they say that the kids get
Autism.
autism. Thank you.
What?
We also have our videos that came in. We're going to be showing a movie night, movie evening.
One of them is Warm Springs. It's all about FDR and the development of that place down there. And it's got Cynthia Nixon in it. It was made a few years ago, but it's got Cynthia Nixon in it that was part of the Sex and the City group. And she, I think she plays Missy LaHand, FDR's secretary. And then FDR is Kenneth Brown. Now, I would not have thought he would have made a good FDR, but when I saw the picture on the video cover, I went, yeah, he does make a pretty good FDR. So, and I know he's a wonderful actor.
So if you know anybody that would like to come to these programs, please tell them to come.
And there's one
Just
on
keep us
smallpox.
posted
That's
when.
Nate and I.
I'll
Yes.
send you the list of it.
Smallpox is coming up real soon, I think.
Influenza.
And the influenza epidemic of 1918, we're going to do one about, and then we're going to do one about COVID and kind of tie it to all of these. So we've got like 4 different programs, and then we've got the movie Warm Springs, and we've got another movie that is about the influenza of 1980.
And that has came in.
When will you be showing that movie?
Well, we've got to set those dates on the movies.
Yeah, we just got
I'd love to
those
see that.
ordered. Yeah, okay. Well, I tell you what, we'll try our best. We'll get in touch with Mr. Tracy and make sure you know when, because we'd love for y'all to see
Well,
those.
thank you, Miss
Well,
Ginger.
we thank you very much.
Yeah.